All right, so if you're trying to keep up with the world of EVs, things are getting pretty wild up here in Canada.
Yeah.
Especially with this whole trade war going on with the U.S. It's like every time you turn around, there's a new headline about tariffs and import taxes, and it's making things, it's making it tough for people in Canada who want to buy an EV.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't realize just how much this trade war is actually impacting the average person who's maybe thinking about making the switch to electric.
Right. Like, I want to help the environment. I want to get off gas. But it seems like all these extra costs are just making it so much harder.
Absolutely. And, it's not like EVs were exactly cheap to begin with. Adding these tariffs on top of that just pushes them further out of reach for a lot of people. It's like this hidden cost that's really slowing down the whole EV transition.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, right? We're trying to encourage people to go green to reduce emissions, but then these policies end up making it more expensive to do the right thing.
It definitely seems counterproductive. And, it's not just the environmental impact that we have to think about. There's also the economic side of things. These tariffs are hurting Canadian businesses and consumers alike.
Right. So it's like this ripple effect that goes beyond just the car industry itself. But okay, so let's back up a bit for those who might not be totally familiar with all the details.
Sure.
Can you kind of break down what's going on with these tariffs and how they're impacting the EV market in Canada specifically?
Absolutely. So basically, it all started with the U.S. imposing tariffs on Canadian goods. And in retaliation, Canada responded with its own set of tariffs on various U.S. products, including a lot of EVs.
Okay, so it's like a tit for tat kind of thing.
Exactly. One country raises tariffs and the other one retaliates, and it just keeps escalating.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it certainly hasn't been good for the EV market in Canada. I mean, the majority of EVs sold here come from the U.S., so these tariffs have made them significantly more expensive.
And I imagine that's making it harder for Canadian EV companies to compete as well.
Absolutely. It's creating this uneven playing field where domestic manufacturers are at a disadvantage because they can't match the prices of their U.S. counterparts, even if their cars are just as good.
It seems like everyone's losing out in this situation, except maybe the politicians who get to grandstand about protecting their own industries.
Right. It often feels like those who suffer the most are the everyday people who just want to buy a car and maybe do their part for the environment.
Okay, so we've got these tariffs that are already in place, but then there's this whole other layer of complexity with this proposal to put a 100% tariff specifically on Teslas.
Right.
I mean, 100%, that just seems insane. What's the logic behind that?
Well, the argument is that it would hit stakeholders who matter to the White House.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's a way of putting pressure on the U.S. administration to reconsider its trade policies. The idea is that if you target something like Tesla, which is, a very high-profile American company, it might get their attention and force them to the negotiating table.
So it's like a strategic move to try to gain some leverage in these trade talks.
Exactly. It's a bold strategy for sure. But whether it'll actually work is another question altogether.
Yeah, I can see how that could backfire spectacularly. Like, what if it just makes the U.S. dig in their heels even more?
That's definitely a risk. And then there's also the question of fairness. I mean, why single out Tesla when other U.S. automakers are also subject to tariffs?
Right. It seems kind of arbitrary. Like, are they just picking on Tesla because they're the most successful EV company?
Well, it's hard to say for sure what the motivations are, but it definitely raises some eyebrows. And it could potentially violate international trade agreements, which could lead to even more complications.
So it's like a high-risk, high-reward kind of gamble.
Absolutely. And the stakes are pretty high. I mean, this isn't just about Teslas. It's about the entire EV market in Canada and the future of electric transportation in this country.
Yeah, I mean, if you make Teslas even more expensive, which they already are, you're essentially pushing people towards gasoline-powered vehicles, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of trying to transition to a greener transportation system.
Exactly. It's like taking one step forward and two steps back.
All right, so we've got this trade war pushing up EV prices, a controversial proposal to target Tesla specifically. And now you mentioned some articles about Chinese EVs.
Right.
How do they fit into this whole trade war puzzle?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. You see, Canada also has a 100% tariff on EVs coming from China.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's been in place for a while now. But with the U.S. market becoming less accessible due to these tariffs, this trade war might actually open the door for Chinese EV companies to enter the Canadian market.
That's a fascinating twist. So instead of protecting the U.S. auto industry, these tariffs could end up giving their biggest competitor an advantage.
Exactly. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. Remember, these tariffs were initially put in place to protect U.S. automakers from competition. but they might end up benefiting Chinese companies who are ready and waiting with a whole lineup of EVs.
So it's like the U.S. unintentionally paved the way for Chinese EVs to potentially dominate the Canadian market. But hold on. How did we even get to this point? Why does Canada have this tariff on Chinese EVs in the first place?
Well, it all goes back to last year when Canada basically followed the U.S.'s lead and imposed these tariffs. At the time, Canada had very limited domestic EV production, so the goal was to shield American automakers from competition.
Okay, so it made sense at the time, but now the landscape is changing rapidly.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation so intriguing. We're seeing this kind of seismic shift in the automotive industry. And it's not just about the technology. It's about geopolitics and trade wars and global competition.
It's like a real-life game of chess, with huge implications for the future of transportation.
Absolutely. And the moves that are being made today will have ripple effects for years to come.
All right, so for someone like me who is genuinely interested in EVs and wants to learn more about this whole situation, what should I know about these Chinese companies? Like, why are they suddenly poised to succeed on a market like Canada?
That's a great question. And I think the first thing to understand is that these Chinese EV companies have been investing heavily in research and development for years now. And they're producing some seriously impressive vehicles. We're not talking about cheap knockoffs anymore. These are high-quality cars with cutting-edge technology, sleek designs, and competitive pricing.
Okay, so they're not just playing catch-up. They're actually innovating and pushing the boundaries of what's possible with EVs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're already making waves in Europe, which is a very demanding market when it comes to cars. So they've already proven that they can compete on a global stage.
Interesting. So what are some of the specific companies that we should be paying attention to?
Well, there are a few big names that are already making headlines, like BYD, NIO, Xpeng, Li Auto. These companies are all producing a wide range of EVs, from compact city cars to luxury SUVs, and they're all starting to set their sights on North America.
Wow, it sounds like the EV market is about to get a lot more crowded.
It definitely is. And that's good news for consumers, because more competition means more choices, better prices, and faster innovation.
Okay, so we've got this perfect storm brewing. A trade war that's pushing up EV prices. A controversial proposal to target Tesla. And now the rise of these Chinese EV companies that are ready to pounce on the opportunity. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's also a really exciting time to be following the EV industry.
Yeah.
Because the landscape is changing so rapidly, and the decisions that are being made today will have a profound impact on the future of transportation.
So it's like we're at this critical juncture where everything is up in the air.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to watch it all unfold.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already, but I want to dive a bit deeper into these Chinese EV companies and what they bring to the table, because I think there's still a lot of skepticism out there about Chinese-made cars. You know, people might have concerns about quality or reliability.
Yeah, I think that's understandable. There have been some concerns in the past. But I think it's important to remember that the Chinese auto industry has come a long way in recent years. They've made significant strides in improving quality and reliability. And they're also focusing on safety, which is a top priority for consumers.
Okay, so it's not like they're cutting corners just to offer lower prices.
Not at all. They're aiming to be major players on the global stage. And that means meeting the expectations of demanding consumers worldwide.
And as you mentioned earlier, they're already proving themselves in Europe, which is known for its high standards.
Exactly. They're winning over European consumers with their technology, design, and performance. So it's not just about price. They're genuinely competitive in terms of quality and innovation.
So it sounds like they're addressing those concerns head on.
Absolutely. And they're doing it through a combination of factors. One major advantage they have is access to a vast supply chain and manufacturing capabilities in China. This allows them to produce EVs at scale and potentially offer lower prices compared to their competitors.
That makes sense. Lower prices would definitely appeal to Canadian buyers who are already feeling the pinch from those U.S. tariffs.
Right. And it also gives them a competitive edge against other global automakers who might be struggling to keep up with the demand for EVs.
Okay, so we've got this trade war pushing up EV prices, a controversial proposal to target Tesla specifically, and now the possibility of Chinese EV companies swooping in to fill the gap. What a mess.
It's definitely a complex situation, but there might be a way out of this. One solution that was proposed in an electric article is to actually drop or reduce those tariffs on Chinese EVs.
Interesting. But wouldn't that just benefit Tesla, though, since they could potentially import from China and avoid those U.S. tariffs?
That's a common concern. But here's the thing. Tesla is already facing significant challenges in the Canadian market. They've had some, shall we say, incredible brand damage lately. and they would face intense competition from other Chinese EV brands that are entering the market.
So it wouldn't be a free pass for Tesla. They'd still have to fight for their share of the pie.
Exactly. And remember, Tesla's already struggling in Europe against Chinese competition. There was no guarantee they'd dominate in Canada either.
So even if Tesla could source EVs from China, it sounds like they wouldn't necessarily have an easy time here in Canada.
Not at all. They'd be up against some serious competition.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually brings us to the potential benefits of reducing tariffs on Chinese EVs for Canada as a whole.
Okay, let's dive into that.
All right.
So what could Canada gain from opening up to Chinese EVs?
Well, first and foremost, it could make EVs more affordable for Canadians. I mean, increased competition generally leads to, better prices, and that's especially important now with the cost of living rising like it is.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, more affordable EVs means more people can actually make the switch, which is, great for the environment.
Exactly. It aligns perfectly with Canada's goals of reducing emissions and transitioning to a greener transportation system.
Plus, it kind of sends a message to the U.S. auto industry that Canada has other options.
Yeah.
Like we're not just going to sit here and wait for them to get their act together.
Right. If U.S. automakers want to stay competitive in the Canadian market, they'll need to offer compelling EVs that can rival the offerings from China, both in terms of price and features.
It's like a wake-up call saying, hey, we're not just going to take it anymore. We're going to explore other options.
Exactly. And I think that's a good thing because it forces everyone to step up their game.
But okay, let's be realistic here for a second. I mean, I know I'm excited about the potential of Chinese EVs, but I'm sure there are some people out there who are a little bit hesitant. They might have concerns about quality or reliability or even data security.
Those are all valid concerns. And it's important to approach this with, a critical eye. But I think it's also important to remember that Chinese EV companies have been making huge strides in these areas. They're investing a ton of money in research and development, they're conducting rigorous testing, and they're meeting international safety standards.
So it's not like they're just cutting corners to offer lower prices.
Not at all. They're aiming to be major players on the global stage. And that means meeting the expectations of demanding consumers worldwide.
And as you mentioned earlier, they're already proving themselves in Europe, which is known for its really high standards. Exactly.
Right.
They're winning over European consumers with their technology design and performance. So it's not just about price. They're genuinely competitive in terms of quality and innovation.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential benefits of reducing tariffs on Chinese EVs, but are there any downsides that Canada should be thinking about?
Of course, any kind of major policy shift comes with potential drawbacks. And I think one concern that people have is the impact on Canadian jobs in the domestic auto industry.
Right. If Canadians start buying more Chinese EVs, could that lead to job losses in, Canadian auto plants?
It's a possibility, but it's not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah.
I think Canada could actually leverage this situation to its advantage. They could try to attract investment from these Chinese EV companies, encourage them to set up manufacturing facilities here in Canada.
So instead of just importing EVs, Canada could become a hub for EV production, creating new jobs and boosting the economy.
Precisely. It's about being strategic and finding ways to turn this, potential disruption into an opportunity. That makes a lot of sense. But what about data security? I mean, that's a huge concern these days, especially with technology coming from China.
It's a legitimate concern for sure, and it's one that policymakers and regulators need to address carefully. We need robust data protection laws and regulations in place, and Canada should work with international partners to establish clear guidelines and standards for data security in the EV industry.
So it's about finding the right balance between encouraging innovation and protecting consumer privacy.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a Canadian issue. Data security is a global concern, and countries around the world are grappling with how to regulate these emerging technologies while still fostering innovation.
It sounds like there's a lot to consider, but overall it seems like reducing tariffs on Chinese EVs could be a win-win for Canada.
It has the potential to be, but it requires careful planning and strategic execution.
Okay, so we've explored the trade war, the Tesla tariff proposal, and the potential rise of Chinese EVs in Canada. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's all interconnected, and it really highlights how these, global events can have a huge impact on seemingly local issues.
So for someone like me who is just starting to wrap their head around the EV landscape, what's the most important takeaway from all of this?
I'd say the key takeaway is that the EV market is incredibly dynamic and constantly evolving. We're witnessing this massive shift in the automotive industry, and It's important to stay informed and be able to adapt to the changing landscape.
Right. It's not just about Tesla anymore.
Exactly. The competition is heating up, and that's ultimately good news for consumers because it means more options, more innovation, and hopefully more affordable EVs on the horizon.
But what does that actually mean for the average Canadian who's, thinking about buying an EV? Should they wait for these Chinese EVs to enter the market?
It's tough to say for sure because the situation is still unfolding and there are so many factors to consider. But it's definitely worth keeping an eye on these developments and seeing how they play out.
So stay informed, do your research, and be prepared for some pretty exciting changes in the EV market in the coming months and years.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to explore those new options.
Now, there was one more point in that electric article that I wanted to touch on. One of the top comments suggested a different approach altogether. Instead of reducing tariffs on Chinese EVs, what if we kept the high tariffs on Tesla, but then tried to strike trade deals with the EU and Mexico?
That's an interesting idea. The commenter's reasoning was that aligning regulations and boosting trade between these regions could help to, accelerate EV adoption on a much larger scale.
It sounds ambitious, but could it actually work?
Well, aligning regulations across multiple countries is always a challenge. It requires a lot of negotiation and compromise. But if it could be achieved, the benefits could be significant.
What kind of benefits are we talking about?
Think about increased trade, more options for consumers, and potentially even a much stronger push for EV adoption across all of these markets. It could create this more unified front in the global transition towards electric transportation.
So it's like forming a coalition of the willing, all committed to accelerating the shift to EVs.
Exactly. And that kind of collaboration could be a really powerful force for change.
But let's be realistic here. Getting the EU and Mexico on the same page when it comes to trade and regulations is no easy feat.
You're absolutely right. There are a lot of political and economic obstacles to overcome, but it's a conversation worth having. And it highlights the need for international cooperation in addressing these, global challenges like climate change.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've got this trade war, a controversial Tesla-specific tariff proposal, the rise of Chinese EV companies, and now the possibility of forging new trade alliances to accelerate EV adoption. It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's all part of the, fascinating, complex world of international trade and the transition to a more sustainable future.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener?
It means that the world of EVs is becoming more diverse and more competitive. It means that you have more options to consider, and it means that the future of transportation is looking increasingly electric.
And it means that staying informed and engaged in these conversations is more important than ever.
Absolutely. Your choices as a consumer can make a difference. The decisions you make about what kind of car you drive have implications for the environment, the economy, and the future of our planet.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave you with one final thought.
We've talked about the potential for Chinese EVs to make a splash in Canada, but this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Think about it. Could this situation be a sign of things to come?
Could this be a preview of how the global EV market will evolve?
Will we see a shift in power from these, established automakers to these emerging players from China?
And what will that mean for the future of transportation, for the environment, and for you as a consumer?
It really makes you think, like, in 5 or 10 years, what are our roads going to look like? Are we going to start seeing a lot more of these Chinese brands, next to the ones we're already familiar with?
Yeah, it's totally possible. And you know what? That brings up another really interesting point about brand perception. Like, are people going to, embrace these new brands? Are they going to be hesitant? Are they going to trust them right away?
It's a good point because it's not just about the car itself. It's also about, like, the image, the brand, the reputation, all of that stuff.
Exactly. And that's something that these Chinese companies are going to have to work on if they really want to succeed here, especially in markets like North America where there's still relatively unknown.
Right. They're going to have to build that trust and prove themselves to consumers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're going to have to convince people that their cars are not only, technologically advanced and reliable, but also, cool, desirable, aspirational.
Well, obviously, it's kind of like what happened with Japanese car companies back in the day, right? Like, they had to overcome a lot of skepticism and build a reputation for quality.
That's a great analogy. And, they did it through a combination of things like innovative products, competitive pricing, and really smart marketing.
So maybe we'll see a similar story play out with these Chinese EV companies.
It's definitely a possibility. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating to watch. We're seeing this potential turning point in the auto industry. And it's really too early to say how it's all going to shake out.
It's like this giant experiment happening right in front of us.
Exactly, and we all get to be a part of it.
Okay, so to kind of wrap things up here, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. We've explored a lot of information today, and it can feel kind of overwhelming, but here's the bottom line.
Yeah, the EV market is changing, new players are emerging, and the old rules don't apply anymore.
And this could mean some really positive things for you as a consumer, like more choices, potentially lower prices, and a faster transition to electric vehicles overall.
But it also means staying informed and paying attention to these developments because the automotive landscape is shifting, and the decisions you make as a consumer are going to play a role in shaping its future.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming because the future of transportation is ultimately in our hands.
That's right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.